Doesn't the world look brighter after a Norwich City win? Even if some of the questions haven't been fully answered, it was much needed, certainly for Dean Smith, certainly for Norwich City, and certainly for those supporters. Welcome to this week's edition of the PinkUn.com Norwich City podcast in association with Future Radio. I'm Connor Southwell, and we're joined after a 3-1 win against Alex Neil's Stoke by Paddy, Davitt and Samuel Seaman. Plenty to discuss, chaps. But Pad, I mean, we sat, when was it, Wednesday we recorded it. It was a bit of an inquest pod, wasn't it, really, after the defeat to Burnley, about where Norwich City were as a club. I still think there's plenty of elements of that performance today that, as I said, probably hasn't answered a lot of those concerns. But a win was what was needed. A win was what was delivered.
Absolutely. And to be fair to Dean Smith, his post-match press there at Carrow Road after that game called it stodgy performance, and I think that encapsulates it perfectly, because by no manner of means was it the leap forward in terms of performance, in terms of structure, in terms of approach with the ball, that he continually is questioned on, and more so on this recent 1 win in 8, because it wasn't being masked by the results. Today they get the result, but the issues around performance are still there. But what today was kind of to turn the clock back to that 9 game, I think it was, winning run, where again performances were not really at the level of consistency you'd like to see or hope to see. But whether it was individual quality or just resolution and digging in at times, I think back to the Sunderland game where they won there and really had to put their bodies on the line for large parts of that game. So it was more a revision to that, and of course they get the result as well. And the goals were quality, the passes, the movement and the finishing as well. So they're the positives, but I wouldn't disagree with Dean Smith. That was a stodgy win, but a win nonetheless. And after 4 defeats in 5, and some serious questions around Dean Smith and his future, maybe externally more than internally. We're not talking about that tonight, and that marks a step forward, but it can only be a start. And again, Dean Smith was very clear to point out this was the first of a 4-game swing into the World Cup break, QPR being the next one at Carrow midweek coming, and they need to continue on. And if they can, 9 points saved from these 4 games, then the world looks a brighter place. The league position, the points on the board, there's a degree then of optimism. And okay, there'd still be plenty of hard work ahead the other side of the international shutdown for the World Cup, domestic shutdown, but at least we wouldn't be, spending the most part of that month, if Dean Smith was still in post, questioning how long he's got, because there's one thing that will insulate him, and that is results. And the questions about performance and style of play and structure with the ball, they'll persist. And nothing we saw today would address those ones, I don't think. But you can't argue with the fact they've scored 3 goals and very nearly kept a clean sheet. Stoke's consolation coming there deep in stoppage time. But badly needed, because and you sensed it in the first half when it was very workmanlike. Some of the misplaced passes, and the crowd were, voicing their dissatisfaction, and that would have only grown and grown, particularly if Stoke had got their noses in front. So what could have been a toxic afternoon turned into a positive afternoon, but still with more questions than answers, I think. But you can only put a win on the board, and they did that. So brief respite.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with what you said. You could have picked that result up and almost slotted it straight in the middle of that winning run where they were perhaps winning games but not being particularly convincing in doing so. It kind of felt like another one of those today. But given the pressure and the mood around the place, I mean, obviously I wasn't in the press conference with you guys, but Dean Smith described it as edgy as he kind of made his way through. There was an edginess around Carrow Road. I felt you could sense that, Sam, actually, in terms of the atmosphere, and it's natural given the run that's been on, given the external pressure that has been on Dean Smith in particular. They almost had to manage that as well as manage the game. I felt. Would you kind of agree? What did you make of the atmosphere inside Carrow Road today?
Yeah, I think they probably scored a goal when they needed one most. There was a little bit of that sort of tetchiness in that atmosphere, maybe getting more and more tense as things went on, and I thought they managed to keep a lid on it to an extent with Ono Hernandez, who obviously is a fan favourite and got on the ball plenty early on and took the ball to the byline, earned a few corners, and I know that didn't really end in anything tangible, but I think it did enough in the early stages to keep the crowd entertained, if you will, keep them alongside the team. And if they'd conceded a goal, I think possibly things would have turned sour very quickly in Carrow Road, but thankfully for them, Stoke didn't finish their chances. They still had those bursts of offensive danger, and although it wasn't a great performance at all, I think they did enough to pacify the crowd for large parts. And actually they scored that second. It was almost the pattern repeating itself. They scored the first after 38 minutes when you felt that a little bit longer without really threatening the Stoke goal, and maybe people would start to turn. And then in the second half, when I thought it actually was most tense, despite them being 1-0 up, I remember Ono Hernandez got booed off. Well, he didn't get booed off, sorry. He was replaced, and it was booed because of sort of the impact on the crowd that he has and the fan favourite status that he boasts. But they scored that second goal right as that was sort of getting to its peak. I think Stoke came the closest to scoring a goal when Nick Powell headed over the bar with the goal at his mercy, really, and they scored the second goal right after that. So I don't want to say they were fortunate with when those goals went in. Obviously, it's their own work, and you can't discredit work that they've done to score those goals. But you do get the sense that perhaps they took things to the real limit in terms of how much leeway they had from that Carrow Road crowd. There were large parts that were unoccupied compared to their own high standards, to be fair, not compared to the rest of the Championship. Compared to the rest of the Championship, it was absolutely packed. But you got the sense going into the game that the supporter base really wasn't particularly happy. And I think they've left it, if not totally happy, in a much better position going into a big game on Wednesday against a very good side in QPR than they were previously. So on that front, they've managed to ward off the danger for a little bit, and probably even a loss on Wednesday I don't think means it would get as toxic as it maybe would have done had they gone 1-0 down today. But let's be clear, you can't keep kicking the can down the road. This game needs to turn into form, and it needs to be a performance or at least a result that's repeated. And they haven't really achieved much yet in terms of their goal for automatic promotion at the end of the season. So they're not quite there. They've certainly found a temporary fix this afternoon, but they're going to have to turn it into a permanent one if they really want those worries to go away for the mid to long term.
Yeah, it needs to be the start of something, doesn't it? I think we've kind of seen false dawns with the winning run before. It needs to be not just results improving, but also performances and probably bursts in games becoming prolonged periods. I think we're not really seeing that. And again, Paddy, it was probably a burst, wasn't it, that carried Norwich City over the line in the end. It was, Sam referenced that substitution on El Hernandez and Isaac Hayden being replaced by Todd Cantwell and Marcelinho Nunez. It completely altered Norwich City's dynamic, their tempo, and for 20 minutes it looked like the team that probably everyone has been waiting to see, didn't it? I mean, obviously we have to place it in the context of perhaps the 70 minutes that went before it, but it was certainly a step in the direction and probably showed why. I know people maybe feel they've been criticised too much, but probably feels like why that criticism has been there, because that's the standard and the quality of these players, but also this group and what kind of the levels people know they can hit when they're on form.
Yeah, I mean, what I found interesting was the second and the third goals was essentially Norwich counter-attacking. It was Stoke committing bodies forward at that stage, trying to chase a way back into the game. And, in this wider debate about style and what suits this group of players under this head coach, maybe they are better counter-attacking sides. The only issue with that is, of course, particularly at Carrow Road, most teams would possibly regress to a low block and let Norwich have the ball and try and break them down. Stoke didn't, to be honest. They tried to be progressive and push Norwich back and had a fair degree of success. But, the manner of the goals 2 and 3, while clinically finished, the backdrop was too many men the wrong side of the ball for Stoke and Norwich breaking at speed. And, when they play like that, they do look like a very effective unit going forward. But again, over the 90 minutes, we didn't see... And to be fair, even the first goal, albeit it wasn't a fully fledged counter, but what it was a turnover. And again, my mind goes back to the Coventry game, when Pukki scores from Nunes locking onto Gustavo Hamer and winning the ball high up in the opposition half. And Dean Smith has talked often about that ability to press and force turnovers in the opposition half. And credit to Liam Gibbs, that's how that first goal was sourced. So, again, from an aesthetic, there's a bit of frustration because you can see in all three goals what could work for a Norwich team under Dean Smith. And... but it's extracting that over, more than clusters of minutes within games, and that's remaining pretty elusive at the minute. And I thought also today, and we've talked about it, and it hasn't really held water given the results they've been on, but the depth of squad, they've been able to introduce Nunes, Zara and Cantwell. All three of them had major contributions for the goals 2 and 3. And that depth of resource that Norwich still possess probably does over the entirety of this championship season, although it's been fairly bumpy at the minute, it probably does push them in and around the top 6. Now, whether they can go on or even better get into the top 2, time will tell. But I think having that squad depth will probably over the entirety mean they are in the playoff mix at least all the way through. And when they've got players of the ability in forward areas of a Cantwell, Nunes, Sarah at this level, with of course Pukki and Ramsey, worth noting today, his first 2 goals since he joined from Villa on loan, there is potential to score goals and create assists. But again, sounds like a broken record. How does Dean Smith meld those players into a style of play or a pattern of play that more often than not allows Norwich to have that control and composure that, we only need to go back 3 or 4 days. Burnley, and they've won again today, to go 2 points clear at the top. They had a very clear style and a template, and all the players were clearly very comfortable within that system, and just the cohesiveness and the control and the composure. That's what I would like personally to see coming through from a Dean Smith Norwich side. And as yet, we haven't seen that. So that's the challenge. But while he's wrestling with that complex equation, if he can pick up results between now and then all well and good. But, the fear is, of course, when the performances are patchy, it doesn't take much for the results to go the other way. And we've just gone through a period where that is the case. And, of course, if you haven't got a template to fall back on, then it's much harder to turn it around. And as we saw, it took, 4 defeats in 5 before we've hopefully got a line in the sand. But, that will be the concern moving forward again, albeit now they have a win to build on, is that the performance itself was, fitful and disjointed in many facets. But in the key moments of this game, where Stoke didn't have that cutting edge, and this was a point Alex Neil referenced after the game in his post-match presser, he felt the difference between the two sides was the clinical edge. Norwich had it, Stoke didn't.
Yeah, agreed. I actually felt for long periods of the game, in probably 2/3, Stoke were the better team for the majority of it. It was just that final one where perhaps the key difference was, and it does help, Sam, when you have players like Teemu Pukki, when you have players like Aaron Ramsey, Todd Cantwell when he came on, who I thought was very good today, and we'll come back onto him. But having that individual quality means that even, and we saw it throughout the winning run really, there will be moments this season where Norwich don't play particularly well, and that has been the case the majority of the time, to be fair. But when you have players of those quality, games can be decided on them, can't they? And it did kind of feel like that today, because you look at the 2 moments really that mattered. One was a bit of quality from Teemu Pukki creating a shot. I think the goalkeeper could probably do better, although it did look like he was unsighted by a defender. And then there was also a bit for the second goal where I felt both Ramsey and Pukki showed quality when they exchanged passes. And then obviously for the third goal, it was a Todd Cantwell pass, wasn't it, after an excellent recovery run. So goals born really from individual quality, which is kind of symptomatic of what Norwich City have been this season.
Yeah, and when things have gone wrong, it's tended to be because they've got none of those players on form or capable of providing that individual quality. You look at the last time they were in the Championship, and there were difficult games where maybe Daniel Farke's team weren't quite as fluid as they could be. But, you had the likes of Todd Cantwell, Emi Buendia Teemu Pukki, even Kieran Dowell at times towards the back end of that season, who were having great games on a really, really consistent basis. In fact, Buendia was pretty much an 8 out of 10 plus every single week. And it's not really a sustainable model to be basing your points getting on, I don't think, especially if Norwich have ambitions of staying in the Premier League in the longer term. But it's done the job on a number of occasions for Norwich this season. But it's difficult to construct an argument for Dean Smith, given the amount of pressure that he's been under in recent weeks, when it seems that the way that his team is grinding out wins is via the much greater quality threshold they have than a number of the teams they play in this division. So I think as good as that is to see at times, Aaron Ramsey producing those sorts of moments at his young age is great to watch for a football fan. And everybody knows that what Teemu Pukki can produce, and Norwich fans love seeing that. But for the success of the team in the long term, you want to see it coming from system and a reliable, consistent thing that you can base things on. You look at the performances of even the likes of Marcelino Nunez, who at the start of the season was seen as I think people maybe even saw him as a Buendia-like find, a bargain for what a player he was. And as soon as he's sort of dipped in his performance, the midfields looked a lot less creative, and they can rely on those sorts of chances being created a lot less than they did before. So, we've seen in recent weeks, with the way that they've played and also in the positive run that came before that, if the best players aren't on form, then that reliability on individual players to perform isn't really a good thing. So, yeah, I'm sure Dean Smith is trying to work on ways that he can improve that output from the team as a whole. And quite a lot of the criticism that's been levelled his way is that the team is performing worse than the sum of its parts. And if you look at the table and the quality that they have within the squad, then I don't think you can argue against that point. But there will be certain things, like perhaps the second goal today, which, yes, it's several moments of individual quality, but it's the sort of goal that you can see teams reproducing on a regular basis if that's something they work on behind the scenes. And I don't believe personally you can score that goal if there hasn't been a lot of work on sort of movement patterns and how you attack as a team and how you go forward quickly. But perhaps that work hasn't been good enough to be able to transmit it through the team for 90 minutes. And you mentioned it earlier. I'm sure Norwich fans will be keen to see the sorts of things that Norwich are producing for 10, 20 minutes in a game across the 90 minutes. And given how effective that can be, we saw in games like Huddersfield, Millwall today, that they can win championship games by doing that for 20 minutes. So imagine what a destructive team they could be if they managed to reproduce that on a consistent basis. So I suppose there's good news and bad news in that department. But what you would say is that it's something you feel that if they can work on and they can improve at, you can only see the team getting better. The worry would be perhaps if they were overly reliant on a team structure and there was no way of getting better than they currently were, and they were in and around the playoffs, there would be more worry about the long-term ambitions of the club. But you look at some of the talent in that squad, some of the things that those players are doing, and you feel that they can be producing that more often. And in the long term, if Dean Smith is as good a coach as he sort of claims he is, and as he suggested when he said that he's improved every team he's been at, it should be good news for Norwich that they've got that quality.
Yeah, and that exactly there is why they're being held to such a high threshold, and why maybe inside that feels, or they feel like there's been a lot of heavy criticism, or a lot of people who have gone too fast too soon. But it's only being measured against the quality relative of the squad, and also what maybe this team should be producing and where it should be, and the sort of results it should be getting and what it should be functioning like as well. And like you said, actually, the second goal, bang on, is something that can be replicated and can be coached and can be a reason why they can improve in terms of their attacking output. And it's just about consistency from here. Pad, let's talk subs, because as we kind of touched upon and worked our way around, it was a crucial moment in the game. I did actually, before we get onto this, want to stand up for Kieran Dowell a little bit, because there was I hope it was a cheer towards Sarah, but I don't know fully. But he had a little bit of a tough spell just before he got replaced, where he misplaced a a few passes. I think his performance needs to be put in context a little bit. He's just come back from laryngitis. That's not a nice illness to have. He's come back pretty quickly from that. I'm sure he's still feeling the effects of that in some form or another, given, he had to withdraw with a shortness of breath. So I think we need to place it in that context before being too critical on him. But that substitution that we spoke about earlier, where it was Hernandez and Hayden coming off, Cantwell and Nunez coming on, it did spark life into a Norwich team and into a game that, again, prior to that, Stoke were having a period. It kind of felt like, if nothing was changed in that moment, that Stoke would have scored an equaliser. So for all the criticism that Dean Smith's had, he deserves a bit of praise for that substitution, doesn't he?
More than a bit, yeah, because, many unflattering comparison with his predecessor. But in this regard, in terms of infecting games through use of subs, excuse me, I think you'd have to say you'd give Smith the edge, even though the results overall in his 50 games, as it is now today, haven't been where they need to be over the span of 2 seasons. But he effectively sealed that game today with his changes and going for a more progressive approach in the middle of the park. You see the second goal, it was Zara and Nunez combining, then it was worked to Nunez, he works it to Ramsey, links for Pookie, a goal. And the third goal was a tremendous pass from Cantwell down the sides for Nunez, running on. First time shot on the run, angle of the box, 6-yard box, keeper parries it, and there's Zara. So, if you're Dean Smith, your final instructions to those 3 to go and affect the game, well, they've delivered, and that's a testament to him. And also, on a more broader point, he's made 6 changes today from the Burnley team, which tells you what he thought of the Burnley performance, I think. And whereas there were a few eyebrows raised at 2:00 this afternoon, he's got the result. And the changes that he made, in terms of the second half introductions, they had the desired effect. So, that's a testament to Dean Smith today, that he has, in a positive fashion, sealed that victory. And also, of course, Ramsey was one of the 6 who came in, so who scored the first goal before half-time. So, all in all, Dean Smith has had a very good day today.
Yeah, absolutely. Sam, one of those players that came on, Todd Cantwell. I mean, if we're talking about people who get held to high expectations and whose former performances have maybe created a higher threshold, he certainly falls into that category. And I think, probably by his own admission, hasn't perhaps hit the heights at Norwich City that many expected when he really sort of burst onto the scene in many senses, particularly in that Premier League campaign. Very good when he came on. I thought he was pretty good at Sheffield United, actually, under the radar. Burnley was a tough night, I think, for most in yellow and green. Felt he was probably a little bit harsh to lose his place in the team, actually. But quietly, slowly but surely, it feels like we're beginning to see his levels improve now as well.
I'd agree with that, and I thought the enthusiasm and the desire to impress within him was something that was very clear to see, and I know it's something we've seen going back to that first friendly against Durham, so I don't want to praise him too much for that, because we've discussed how that's not enough. But as soon as he's come on, you've seen him sprinting around, and he makes what I think Alex Neil felt was a foul before, in the lead up to that second goal. But to see him towards the back end of goals, finding that pass for Nunez, was something we've been calling on him to do throughout the season, really, and trying to think back to when he was last that heavily involved in a goal. I think it was against Coventry, when he's played a lovely pass through to Josh Sargent to hold up and then lay off to Kieran Dowell to score. And that's a big gap for somebody who, in the Championship, is seen as a sort of chief creator, and certainly, especially outside the Norfolk bubble, is now understood by the rest of the league to be one of the top players in that department. I think Norwich fans, given the performances he's produced before at a higher level as well, are totally right to expect more from him. And to see him involved in the way that he was today was really, really good to see. And you get the sense he's a bit of a confidence player, because he had that 2018-19 season, which was sort of his breakthrough, didn't produce a lot, and maybe there were questions about how much he was going to feature in the subsequent Premier League campaign. Then as soon as he puts 2 or 3 good performances together at that level, he soars and has the best period of his career. Then as soon as he loses that form, he's not really on that level for another couple of years, really. So it feels like he's probably the sort of confidence player that will get a lot from that performance today and from that contribution to the Gabriel Sara goal. So I think it's good news for Norwich in the long term that they've got a player like that. And, you know, with somebody like Marcelino Nunez maybe now finding a little bit more of a natural level for somebody who's just come from a very different league in the Chilean league, it's probably good to see another source of creativity come from, you know, a different area, because what was Norwich City's undoing in a big way in the Premier League last time was losing pretty much the sole creator that they had in the Championship in 2020 and 2021. So yeah, I think it's very encouraging to see him contributing those sorts of performances. It's the type of performance I feel we maybe needed, a reminder that he can produce, because at the start of the season, when he'd had a long time without a Norwich shirt, I think that absence maybe made the collective heart grow fonder amongst the Norwich City fan base. But I've seen recently discourse sort of on social media and among Norwich fans that they maybe wouldn't be too upset if he was released from his contract at the end of the season, and that tells you maybe how much that shine has worn off in some quarters of the supporter base. And I think he really needed that reminder. I don't know where it's come from. You know, I've just said that he seems to me quite a confidence player. So based on not being able to produce those sorts of moments for a long time, you have to give him credit for having the right attitude and still believing that he can do that, because that wasn't the pass of somebody who was lacking confidence or didn't see themselves as a creator. It was between two defenders, it was into the box, and those are the sorts of passes that, you know, teams pay the big bucks for, and those are the sorts of players that are the hardest to find. So if he can continue producing moments like that, it will be of great use to Norwich City. But it's almost similar to the discussion we had about the whole team a little bit earlier when we said about the consistency, because two of those moments so far in the season really isn't enough for a player of his talents, and a player who a lot of people earmarked as having a big season even in the Premier League, you know, sort of a year and a half ago. So you certainly want to see him build on that, and if that's a one-off, it's not really enough. But if he can produce moments like that more regularly, and I certainly believe he can, especially with a little bit of confidence behind him, then he could be like a fantastic new signing for Norwich. And it's a little bit of a cliche, but to have that bonus coming from somewhere, and it's a bit of an odd comparison to make with Todd Cantwell, but I remember Seb Basson coming back into the group in, I think it was January 2015, and the massive impact that had. He was a player that was already at the club, and he added another level to a defence that had looked shaky under Neil Adams. Now Todd Cantwell can maybe do this season after having a sort of middling first period in the season. Can he come and add something to an attack that's looked like it maybe needs another dimension? If he can continue to produce moments like this, he can, and that could be massive for Norwich in the future.
I mean, the one thing for me that has never changed with Todd Cantwell is when he plays like he did today, and to an extent how he played last weekend. Although I thought there were different performances, which we'll get into in a moment. But when he plays like that, he's glorious to watch. He really is. Just in terms of how he moves and how he technically how he plays the game, it's really watchable. He's a really watchable footballer when he's in that form, and I guess that's why when he's out of form it becomes quite difficult, because he can look quite luxury, I think, and whatnot, which is why I was impressed with last weekend, because it felt to me, I don't know if this is something that's happened consciously or something that's happened unconsciously, but it feels to me like when he initially came back to Norwich, there was a real desire, as we said, to make an impression, and that kind of was, I need to score a goal, I need to create something, I need to impact an attacking phase of play by doing something really noticeable. Whereas now, I think he obviously had that injury that meant he's been sidelined for a bit. He's been in and out of the team. Sheffield United felt to me like him almost going back to basics and focusing on the overall performance. And because, much like with a team, if you're a player, if you get that aspect right, I think you do get your just rewards with it. And we kind of saw it today as well. A focus on, no, I'm going to go and win the ball back, and then I'm going to play the pass, and it doesn't matter if that ends in an assist or not. It's kind of a focus on the overall game, and that shift, again, whether consciously or unconsciously, feels quite important for him, which I guess, I mean, you mentioned his contract. It does beg the question now, if you were Stuart Webber, obviously we've got a World Cup break coming up, would you be using it to start talks on a new deal for him, or do you still feel we need to perhaps see a little bit more from him? I guess it probably, in terms of output, really is probably where this conversation leads before we enter the realms where a new contract becomes a possibility.
Well, there's a big elephant in the room in that discussion, and that's Norwich City's finances at the moment. We know, and we've reported on it, that they could be in hot water if they're not promoted, probably this year, but certainly in the next couple of years. And I think that may well dictate a lot of the contract discussion.
But I guess the caveat to that is, if you have a player like him, and it's a big if, but if you can get this sort of consistency out of him, he's someone who is going to make you money, isn't he?
Yeah, and if it was any normal situation, I've taken the fun out of the discussion a little bit there by mentioning the financial situation. But if it was any normal situation, it's not really much of a gamble to give Todd Cantwell that opportunity, is it? And perhaps even the fact that he hasn't been totally impressive the last year or so works in their favour at the moment, because his value, you look at how much they'll have to give him wages-wise now compared to what they might have had to give him when they was interested in him from Arsenal. And that's vast. There's a vast difference in those two sums of money. So perhaps now it's a little bit like capitalising when the housing market is down. You need to go in there.
Yeah, this pod's taking a turn, didn't it?
Excellent analogies from me, but no, it's. I think it's a situation where things probably do work in Norwich City's favour in the going into contract negotiations, but it is a little bit more of a gamble than if they had waited maybe 3 months. They could wait 3 months and he could score 8 goals, and then he's got 4 clubs willing to take him for free next summer, and he's got various offers from various clubs, and his value rockets, and that's something Norwich won't want to take a gamble on. So I'm interested to see how they deal with that situation. There's no doubt, given how far in advance they plan, that those discussions will already be being had, whether it's maybe not even with Todd Cantwell, but somebody's having a discussion in that football club at a high level about Todd Cantwell's contract situation. Dean Smith spoke at the start of the season that he needed to earn it, and it's been a good amount of time since then. So I suppose it's still being weighed up, and it's still in the balance, but Todd Cantwell certainly is playing like somebody that wants a new contract. And if he can continue to produce, it's an absolute no-brainer. But it could be a situation that we're sat here in 2 weeks' time and he's put in 4 poor performances, and it's looking ludicrous that we were suggesting he would be in line for a new contract anytime soon. So it's probably one to watch out for, and it probably is one where the longer things go on, the more Norwich will understand about the situation. But given the need to take risks that they've spoken about regularly with their financial models, maybe less given recent developments, but given how often they've spoken about the requirement to take risks, maybe they will need to do that sooner rather than later.
He'd be at the top of my list. I've got to say, out of the players who are out of contract next summer, he'd be the top of my list to get a new deal, just because of, I feel like, irrespective of what direction Norwich go in from here, he's going to have some form of role to play. Either he's involved in the rebuild and what comes next, and that will have to be a youthful, younger-looking Norwich City side, and I think there's a massive role for him in that. Or if it was promotion, even still, I still think he's a player worth taking that risk on at this stage, at this moment, and particularly if he can continue with the type of performance that we saw from the bench today. Obviously, like you say, it's now about consistency. I think people forget how young he is as well at points. But yeah, I would be starting those conversations pretty swiftly, I have to say, because that is a player who, even now, Norwich could make real money on, particularly, of course, given he came through the academy. Pad, just on today, I mean, this result in terms of Dean Smith, because there's been a lot of focus on him, and we spoke, pretty much our whole podcast in the middle of the week was on him and his position. What does this do for him now in the short term? Do you think this win, I guess probably trying to look into a crystal ball a bit, but to me it feels like this win will probably, given how close we are to the World Cup break, allow him to get to that point, unless things went really off a cliff from here, which to be honest I don't really see happening.
No, and I'm not even going to hypothesise QPR come here and win 4 or 5, and that might go down. But
Well, I guess that's the question, because if
Yeah.
if QPR is another step back, it's almost going to feel like we're back at square one, isn't it? So I guess although it's probably eased, it's not completely gone away, that question.
Oh no, it's definitely not gone away. No, and that is the problem now, because they've lost a fair chunk of ground and failed, alarmingly to plateau out. Even if they'd won 3 or 4 of the last 8 rather than 1 of the last 8 prior to this afternoon, then there isn't this crescendo of noise around his position, which is inevitable. If you're the book stops with that guy ultimately, and if he's failing to that degree, then we've seen it. What are we up to now? 9, 10 championship changes managerial wise this season already. Frightening turnover. So there's respite now. There won't be any talk in the next period about Dean Smith and his future and time to get him out the door and find a replacement and Russell Martin and but the reality is, if they, win one of the next 3, lose 1, draw 1, then we're not materially that further on, and those questions will still overhang for that month-long pause for the World Cup. And then if they don't start well the other side in the run-up to the festive swing, then we'll be back here again. But of course, then it's the urgency increases, because you're getting further and further into a season that they have to be competing at the right end of it, and if they're not materially doing that, there's a different dynamic to 30 games left of the season and 20 games or 15 games left if we get into early part of 2023. So, and he'll know that. Ultimately, he'll know that they have to build on this now today, and ideally get a win against QPR, and then the madness of the Championship suggests that they'll be firmly back in that mix. I think they've gone back into the top 6 after today's results, so that just underlines it. Yes, it felt like they slipped away quite dramatically from where they were, but fundamentally they've won a second game in 9 now, and they're back in the top 6. So they follow that up over the next 2 or 3 games, then it's going to look like a good platform for the second half of the season. And I thought it was interesting, actually, post-Burnley, when Dean Smith reflected on these next 4 games, but more or less packaged it in terms of just getting ourselves into a position where we can really put the accelerator down post-World Cup break, get maybe some of these injured players back fully fit, and then really have a concerted attempt at ideally getting in the top 2, but if it's not to be, then the top 6. So it feels like we're in a positioning period now. It's just about placing them in a position where they haven't lost too much ground post World Cup break, and that they can really string results, ideally performances together. And if you do that, we've seen it with Burnley now, most notably, you get on a winning seam, you can fairly quickly shoot up the table in this league. And that, as he said himself after the Burnley game, came from much further back when he was with Villa, albeit that was through the playoffs. But I don't think he's panicking or doubting his ability to get Norwich in the top 6. But, that said, can you imagine if it is another defeat we're dissecting this evening? I think most of the discussion would have been about the reaction, because it would have been pretty negative, pretty toxic, and inevitably part of that conversation would have been, is it time up for Dino? So that is the tightrope he's walking, basically, that he's now in a position where he really can't afford